All righty. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us on such incredible short notice. My name is Rocky Cole. I'm one of the founders of iVerify, and we're going to talk to you today about some iOS findings that we think has really broad implications for mobile security. If you think about the history of mobile exploitation and mobile security, you know, I started my career in government many years ago, and when I was in government, mobile hacking wasn't really a thing. There were very few vulnerabilities that were discovered and patched. Certainly, there weren't, really, expensive mobile malware kits floating around. And so fast forward to today, at the sort of pre-pandemic, there was billions of dollars poured into companies like NSO Group, who built tools like Pegasus. And those tools were deployed around the world for lawful intercept purposes. You'd see occasional abuses of those tools. You'd see, you'd see a journalist being spied on. You'd see maybe a political rival or an activist being spied on. But you never really saw anything that sort of rose to the level of what you might call a mass attack. As things progressed after that, we started to see the top cyber actors in the world, Russia, China, Iran, presumably the United States, adopt these sorts of tactics and techniques and tools as well. Last summer, for example, we reported on some very sophisticated exploitation associated with the presidential campaign in the United States, also targeting large media companies out in media companies in the United States and large technology companies out in Silicon Valley. These still rose to sort of the standards of what you might call, advanced persistent threat group operations. They were largely targeting the people you would think China, Russia, and Iran would target. What we're going to tell you about today is a continued evolution of the mobile threat. And I personally have been predicting for many years now that the mobile security community would have something similar to for those of a certain age, you may remember Eternal Blue from a few years ago. That was it was a piece of malware built by the U.S. government that spun out of control and was used in the NotPetya and the WannaCry attacks. And it really was one of the accelerants to widespread adoption of tools like EDR, companies like CrowdStrike becoming $1 trillion company. It changed the cybersecurity industry and it shifted the landscape. And one of the things it did is it moved people onto mobile phones, which had more rigorous architectures. And I've been predicting that the mobile security world would have sort of an Eternal Blue moment. And from our perspective, this is what we found here. We found a tool that was very likely developed by a nation state. We can talk about the details of why we think that is true later. Very likely developed by a nation state, very likely developed by or for the US government, that has been on a strange journey through zero-day brokers around the world and used by Russian operatives to surveil Ukrainians and criminal groups to steal cryptocurrency. And it represents a shift from the targeted attacks against mobile devices that we've been used to an age when truly we're talking about mass exploitation of iPhones in particular, which is something we haven't seen today. So I'd like to turn it over to the team here to go really deep on this. We have two people from iVerify on the call. We have Spencer Parker, our Chief Product Officer, formerly of CrowdStrike. So he's no newbie to threat intelligence briefings. You're in good hands here. And then also our VP of Research and one of my co-founders of iVerify, Matthias Fraulingsdorf, one of the world's experts in iOS internals and iOS exploitation. And so over to you to dive a little deeper, fellas.
Many thanks for that intro, Rocky. Welcome everybody to the call. As I say, we're going to go pretty deep today into this new attack that we've seen. Matthias is going to cover a lot of the deep technical stuff. We're going to try to keep it as high a level as we possibly can to keep everybody engaged and following this. I will say that if you want to get really deep, we've released a full technical blog today of what we know so far, but this is just the start of what we know. these things take an awful lot of time to analyze and to find every little nuance to it. So Matthias and team are going to be busy for quite some time yet, getting to the bottom of all of this. And we will continue to release new blogs as we find new interesting things out about this attack. So just to sort of summarize what we're going to go through, this started out from an exploit link that we had found on a number of different sites, many of them being Chinese-speaking sort of crypto and commodity type forums that use social engineering to make people click on a link. So this is technically what we would term a watering hole attack that is a one-click attack. All it requires is the user to click the link and, as Matthias will go into in quite some detail very shortly, it's game over. There is remote code execution and LPEs that actually get the modules installed on these things, and they are, they're owning that phone at that point to do whatever they want with whatever modules they want to deliver down to it. I will say, just as a word of warning, our blog does list all of the domains in it, and as far as we know, the vast majority of them are still active. As of yesterday, they were active in many cases. So please treat the intelligence in our blog as it should be treated, and do not actively go to one of these, especially if you've got an iPhone. Not a good idea. The team itself, we exposed 23 different exploits across 5 different exploit chains that this framework was delivering down to the device. We're going to talk more about this as a framework later. It is not just a single chain that hopes and prays it gets the right phones. This is a true framework that works out what phone you've got, what version of iOS you've got, and then delivers down the right exploit chain for that to be successful. We've seen these exploits work from iOS 13 through to 17.21. There are sort of various reasons why things past that haven't been exploited so far, but we'll also show that this framework is very easily added to, and that other exploits could be added in to cover newer versions of iOS in this very simply. The iOS exploit framework is confirmed as Coruna. This was confirmed as well today in a blog post from Google Threat Intelligence Group, who have detailed this in detail as well in it. Our analysis of this and Google's analysis was independently done, but and they have given us some more color that we hadn't found, and we got color that they hadn't found. So we do want to say, though, that although this story is really about the first mass scale iOS attack, Android is also infected, but there's not really a story in that. It's surprise, surprise, you can infect Android through sideloading APKs. There's nothing new about that, and there's nothing novel about the malware that it's delivering. It's just as effective as it always is. And finally, iVerify, we are not attributing this attack to any specific adversary at this time. We do believe the attack that's ongoing right now is criminal in nature, even though the framework is not, and Matthias will detail more of that later. But we are not in the business of adversarial attribution when we don't have a high confidence in that attribution, which we do not at this stage. Again, if that changes over time, we will go out to press on that. But right now, we don't. So with that, I'm going to pass across to Matthias.
Thank you very much, Spencer. And also thank you very much, Rocky, for the introduction. And let me get a little bit more detailed into what we started to observe. Mid of February, we basically started to investigate a suspicious domain. You can see the full name of the domain here. It's hosted in China behind Cloudflare's infrastructure. And this particular domain did not just host the particular export chain that we have observed later on, but it also observed a configuration profile for iOS where they tried to trick someone into manually installing a sort of web clip onto the phone, which would then be using as a home screen icon to open a web page. It also contained an APK that was hosted there. but it also is a subpart of this web page contained an exploit chain that we noticed basically infected an iPhone when we were running this on an older version. Based on our analysis of the framework, we can see that this should support iOS version 13 up to 17.2.1, and there is a couple of vulnerabilities in the chain that are used for privilege escalations or bypassing Apple's mitigations that might also be working up to 17.4, but the initial remote code execution exploits in Safari are only applicable up to 17.2.1. Many of these vulnerabilities that we have seen there exploited were mentioned that they were previously exploited in the wild by Apple. Some of them were even used by different threat actors before. Operation Triangulation also did use a couple of the vulnerabilities in their own exploits before. In total, it's a massive framework of these had 23 different exploits and 5 different exploit chains. And we can also see that a little bit later on that this framework is in active development, and that the threat actor behind this is changing the framework over time and is deploying more and more infrastructure. We have found additional domains in past searches that were used to also spread the malware, and we can see that there is, or we can also see in Google's blog post that there were also a similar threat actor or like a different threat actor that used this against people in Ukraine. And there is a customer of a commercial spyware company that also bought this. Okay, let's move to the next slide, please. Okay. Now, when we started to analyze this, we found that at the very end, there was a couple of cryptocurrency modules that matched the kind of websites where we found the framework and the links in, which were a lot of the like cryptocurrency commodity forums. Another angle here is anything that is not related to like safe for work content, and the actual domain that we shared here is also displaying something that I would not call necessarily safe for work. As I mentioned before, Google did release a blog post today on the framework that they shared, including additional domains that were used. And they also showed that, that the framework was developed, or it seems to be developed by a Chinese threat actor, because many of the initial debug strings in the module were actually contained in China. Let's move ahead, please. Okay, so what did we do once we had SendLink? What we wanted to do, and this is one of the like expert things for our company, we started to do a full forensic investigation into the different chains. We also used static and dynamic analysis. In that case, dynamic analysis just means that we basically infected a couple of different phones. And then we started to take forensic dumps of the data to see which traces might have been left behind, which traces would have been deleted. And we tried to corroborate this with additional like analysis of the code of the malware itself. What you can see here in the screenshot is a capture with a proxy. This is like a network communication interception tool that we used for analyzing this. In order to do this, we basically installed like another root certificate authority onto our devices. Interestingly, the entire exploit server did not care about this at all. Normally, I would suspect some like advanced attacks like these to have a bit better or like a better safeguards around making sure that exploits and implants would not leak. And we could basically capture with this the entirety of all the 23 different exploits and the 5 different chains here by just basically intercepting the entire network traffic and dumping this. Already on the slides, you can see here the different kind of parts that were linked in the chain. Everything that basically starts with a .js, a question mark, a couple of random characters, up until the .min.js part are the different exploits, which were partly written in JavaScript and later on in like native iOS code. Additionally, for the network proxies, we analyzed crash logs, we captured sysdiagnosis. In that case, we did that pre-infection, live during the infection, but also post-infection. We took encrypted backups, pre and post infection, and we also did capture full file system dumps because for some of these devices, we still had like jailbreaks available. And we could gather the entire content. And then this is what we used and started to investigate all of the different components of the chain. Let's move on to the next one, please. Yeah, in more detail, I'm just going to talk about one of the particular chains here, which is the one that we captured on iOS 16.6, but all of the other chains are working in the same kind of logic. You will always have a loader file that is actually the same across all different iOS versions. That is called analytics.html. And then this loader will do a couple of like very basic triage steps to see, am I actually running on an iPhone? Might I just be running inside of some sort of like Chrome headless browser? And depending how the result is, it will actually start and orchestrate the different exploits that are following later on. Due to a lot of the modern security mechanisms that we have nowadays on iPhones, there is actually a couple of different bypasses that all WebKit exploit chains need to have. So we not only have the initial part of the remote code execution in WebKit, we also need to have a pack bypass, a local privilege escalation, potentially a PPL bypass, or on newer iPhones, even an SPTM bypass. And in most of these cases, we have different exploits or different parts which are used here. In a later stage of the exploit chain, we can see that the exploit itself moves on to basically build a native code loader that is called like a Mach-O loader. This is then used together with some local privilege escalation to spawn a stage 2 inside of PowerD. This stage 2 in PowerD is going to then load another implant from the server that is going to be spawned as a stage 3 inside of location D. This is then what we would call, or what the framework itself also calls, the core payload. And inside of location D, it's going to be continuously running and communicating back with the C2 server. This core payload is then responsible for loading additional implant modules. There is one for IM agent that is then subsequently used for C2 communications. And it also has a backup module where C2 communication can be run over iMessage or SMS. There is another module that's responsible for springboard hooking to see if the device is currently locked, if it's unlocked, if the screen is active, if it's not active. And then there is additional modules for WhatsApp and a lot of different cryptocurrency wallets. Interestingly, what we can see here is if we compare our findings against Google, that Google did not see an initial WhatsApp module or even an IM agent module that was like launched inside of the sample. They only had the cryptocurrency stealers. While we can see a couple months later when we captured the chains that these threat actors now also have this kind of IM agent module and the WhatsApp modules that are used here. Yeah, thank you, Spencer. So what are the results of our investigation? So we totally managed to find all the configuration files and all the imported modules of the entire framework. We could also make a note of the techniques that were used and how sophisticated this specific threat actor is. And what you can basically see here is that there is multi-stage development of all the different modules, and depending on the iOS version, they were dragging different modules used for different bypasses. The entire framework is very, very, very well written in terms of an attacker's perspective, but it's also very, very well written in terms of an engineering perspective. There is so many different error codes which are clearly defining the different stage where the implants and where the exploits are currently in, also in order to make sure that it is really going well or it's aborting into the right state. This is not very typical for a lot of the other commercial spyware implants or even exploits that we have seen, which is also why our assumption, it's not an attribution, but looks more towards that this is an exploit kit or frameworks that might have been used by a nation state actor or was sold to a nation state actor. Yeah. Additionally, when we looked at the implants or at the other part, the story changes a little bit. And a lot of the other like implants are like basically leveraging the very good engineered exploit framework in order to get their job done. But the code looks a little bit more sloppy, or the code is also leaving more and more artifacts behind. If you look at all the forensic indicators that we're sharing for this particular campaign right now, there's actually a lot of different files which are left persistently on the phone. There's a lot of different databases that contain information on the network infrastructure. There's lots of different ways that you could have basically used in order to detect this particular framework if you would have had access on the phone, or if you can be using like forensic data sets. And what I mentioned also before is that we can basically see that that the same vulnerabilities have been also used, or like Google said that the same vulnerabilities have been used here also by triangulation, and were similar to some part of the leak what Kaspersky showed. This only applies to the vulnerabilities which are used here. I don't think that the exploit code for triangulation was ever made public. And we haven't seen this in our particular models, but we have seen it in the modules that Google shared, that they still, in the modules that the blog post that Google published, sorry about that, that they still contain like debug strings written in Chinese, while everything else that we can see in code of the like core exploit framework is clearly written in plain English, and the speakers of the entire framework seems to be native English speakers. Okay. Good. I got into this entire scene when Google published their first evidence of nation-state actors using exploit chains like this in the wild, which was against a group of Uyghurs in 2019. And now we're 7 years later, and this is the first time that we're actually seeing that there is a mass scale attack on iPhones, which were conducted by criminals. We have always suspected that this is going to happen at some point in time. And in that way, I'm maybe also sorry to say that this is now the first evidence that we're seeing here. So what can we do here? We've tried to publish as many IOCs as possible, that other people can actually start to hunt for infections, that other people can start to work on seeing if they find other ways of detecting the specific threat actors. We have also shared a Stix2 file that you can use with Amnesty International's MVT tool, which should be able to find this particular attack in a backup. We've also made available all the other IOCs that we used in like other diagnostic informations like sysdiagnosis or crash logs today on our blog. Many of these IOCs were also able to check in our iVerify products. So if people want to install the iVerify basic application, we should be able to detect this particular attack. And even though if the phone was previously attacked with this particular exploit framework, and we made it free until May to help to protect and detect this for as many people as possible. Aside from that, there's obviously the advice to patch to the latest version of iOS. In this case, it's 26.3, because many of the vulnerabilities were already patched, and then you would not be able to get attacked. And obviously, lockdown mode is a very, very good advice, but it might not be suitable for everyone. This particular chains would have been cat or like basically stopped by lockdown mode, because many of them were related to WebKit. And also, upgrading the phones to the latest hardware is definitely always making it harder for attackers to bypass more and more mitigations. Good.
Well, okay. Matthias, thank you for that. We'd like to open the floor up to Q&A now. Before we do, I'll just make one final remark in terms of the implications for this. You know, if you had to take away one or two things from this talk, the takeaway, the first thing I would suggest you take away from this is that I think this marks the beginning of a time when mobile threats are moving away from highly targeted attacks to things that are more mass in nature, meaning spray and pray, meaning that it's not just VIPs or the CEO of the company. It's not just, you know, the sort of the people that you would think would be targeted with really sophisticated spyware. We're at a point now where this truly could be anyone and everyone. That's the first takeaway. The second thing I want to highlight is Matthias mentioned that lockdown mode is effective here. Something that's not effective against a tool that is not an effective mitigation for this kind of exploitation are things like MDMs, MAM containers, and things like that. Those are management tools, and they're useful and they're needed, but they don't tell you when to respond and how to respond. They're useful knobs for turning, but they give you very little signal for turning knobs. So that's the second thing that I think people should take away here is that if you are running a business and you have a bunch of phones in the workplace and you think that you have a MAM tool on there or a container on there, this exploit has ring zero access, and once you're ring zero, you are the user. You can log in to any system, any corporate system that has an app on the phone. And so you like the take of the implications for enterprises, which are many of our customers, are that it first of all protect the entire workforce against mobile exploitation, not just the VIPs. Move beyond management and implement real security tools. And then I think the most important thing is just acknowledging that this is potentially a sea change in the threat vector for mobile phones. So I would say those would be the things that if you're one of our enterprise customers or business listening in, that those would be the things that I would say are top of mind. So let's go to the Q&A. We have one Q&A. We have one question already in the queue from Tim Starks. He says, how mass is this attack exactly? How do you measure that? Spencer, you've managed to poke around with this a little bit. You gave me an answer to this question earlier when I asked that I thought was very satisfying. Would you like to take the first crack at it, and maybe Matthias will have something to add to it?
Sure. So we obviously know the IP address of the C2 that is involved in this attack. So looking at the data available to us through various different third-party vendors that monitor the internet, we had a look and saw how many like direct sessions to that IP address happened. So now bear in mind, this is in China, so this data is not complete. First and foremost, this isn't like the US or the UK where the data gathered in by these third-party intelligence vendors is pretty complete. China is not. So whatever figure we're going to give you now is basically going to be bigger in reality. But we can only back that up by the data that we can actually see. And we know that the average number of connections or sessions, I should say sessions, because this is NetFlow data that this is taken from. So a session, can have multiple HTTPS requests in it. It is only once the TLS session is broken down that session ends. And we're seeing on average around 6 sessions that come back to this, the mobile C2 involved in this. So we look at the number of connections to that IP and we divide that by 6 because that's the average number. And that gave us a figure of approximately 42,000 devices we believe that this may have infected. Now, that may not sound like a massive number compared with some Android infections or Windows or Mac infections that have happened. But in the stakes of iOS, this is a massive number.
Well, and Spencer, if I'm not mistaken, we were working off a kind of limited number of domains that we had, and when Google published their blog today, if I'm not mistaken, there were quite a few other domains in there that we've not even had.
There were other ones that we need to. This is based upon one C2.
Right. This is one C2 that we found, and then when Google published today, we learned that there were, dozens more.
Yeah.
Right.
We need to investigate that further, but the reality is the number was still way higher than we anticipated. Yeah. And by iOS standards, it is mass scale.
Right. And it has the potential, once we investigate these other domains, it could be these other domains have zero traffic and there's nothing, and this is the total number. It also could be that those other domains have a ton of traffic and the number is much higher. So there's just a lot of variability in the answer there.
Yeah.
What other questions do we have?
So there's another question just come in. Can you reiterate the factors that point to development by or on behalf of the US government?
Yes, I will start with this. So, so I will say, first of all, we don't, we cannot attribute who is the operator behind it. So first of all, we do not know who is operating the tools. That we don't know. But as far as who developed the tools, that's a little bit different. So first of all, I've been out of government for over a decade. I have none of these fancy mobile exploit kits existed when I was in government. I have no guilty knowledge. I've not directly seen the US government's exploit frameworks. But what I can say is the code base for the framework and the exploits was superb. It was elegantly written. It's fluid. It holds together very well. There were comments in the code that, as someone who's been around the U.S. defense industrial base for years, really are reminiscent of the sort of insider jokes and insider remarks that you might see from a U.S.-based coder. Certainly, they were native English language speakers. It smacks of Americans, frankly, in terms of the sorts of comments that were there, the sorts of humor that you might expect. There were also similarities in terms of some modules bear a striking resemblance to, as I think Spencer or Matthias mentioned earlier, op triangulation, which Kaspersky Labs published on a few years back, and the Russian government publicly attributed to the U.S. government. I don't believe there's ever been a better theory for what triangulation is. I've never heard anyone else claim it was something else. And certainly the U.S. government has been very quiet on this. So I think that, like, if we're calling a spade and we're putting money down on the table, like, I think it's a good bet that triangulation probably had some nexus to the U.S. government, and the parallels with the code bases between triangulation and this, and the fact that the code base is quite fluent, make me fairly comfortable saying that I think it's a good bet, though certainly not a sure bet, that at least the framework and the exploits may have had their origin in the U.S. defense industrial base. Now, obviously, again, we can't say that for sure, right? I don't know what the U.S. government has. I have no direct knowledge of this, and it may come out later that this isn't. This could be commercial spyware, from Europe or from Israel, or who knows. I'm not definitively saying anything. But we also do know, as a fact, that there was a news story last week that there were tools developed by a U.S. government vendor, a company that contracts with the U.S. government, that were sold on secondary markets to zero-day brokers. So we know there are at least U.S. government tools out there, and then you add all that up with everything I just said, and I think it basically forms a mountain of circumstantial evidence, but certainly no smoking gun. I see another question here. Speak of the culpability of the U.S. government in terms of this tool getting out and being used, such as it has, by Russian espionage actors in financial crime. Look, I think the quote here is the genie's out of the bottle. I mean, like, there's been billions and billions of dollars poured into the development of these kind of exploit kits, and there's a lot of them out there, right? Like, the threat intelligence community, if you ask around, will tell you that at any point in time, there's maybe a half dozen of these things floating around. And we saw the same thing happen with desktop, 15 years ago when I was in government. I mean, it's the same story. Everyone was using antivirus on their desktop computers, and the U.S. government was throwing these really exotic, complex exploits at endpoints. And the defenses didn't stand a chance. And so you saw the rise of, EDR and CrowdStrike. But those tools eventually spun out of control. Like, if you're throwing those tools around, someone will steal them, intercept them, leak them, get their hands on them. And it's kind of one of these things that, like, if you build it, people will come, and these tools exist. They're being built at scale. They continue to be built. They continue to be used because there's a lot of intelligence value on mobile devices. And I think it's kind of an inevitability that when there's this many of these tools floating around, one of them is going to leak out, and that's just been the case with U.S. government built tools and government built tools, for the last 20 years. I don't know why mobile would be any different. Of course, you're welcome. What other questions do we have?
Surprisingly little questions too. I think Matthias has blown them all away.
Maybe while we see if there's anyone else having a question. Just a technical note on how mass scale this attack could be. We managed to capture all of these different exploits and implants via like network traffic analysis. So anyone else can pretty much do the same that is familiar with this kind of process. It was not a very sophisticated point in time. So now people can steal all of these chains and can reuse them again. And anyone could deploy this on some web servers and could also use the framework to basically attack other people. The hard work was already done by developing the exploit framework. Now developing some part of the implants or using the same implants and setting up a web server is not that super much difficult. So we should all consider that these iOS versions are now pretty much used by, or could be used by crime groups to exploit people like in the world. And I would be very, very, very careful with this. It doesn't have to stay with China. Now, what happens if Scattered Spider now get their hands on these kind of things and starts deploying those? There is not that huge technical challenge anymore once these tools are out, and they're out. So that period is just over.
I agree with that wholeheartedly. And that's a really good point, Matthias. We have a question here. Has iVerify reached out to U.S. government about this, like NSA Cyber Command? No, we haven't. They would not say anything anyway. If it were their tools, you would just never hear back from them. You take that from me as a former, person in this world. Very little utility to doing that. I believe some of the reporters that have covered the story have done so. I don't believe they've heard a lot back either. But it's a good question.
Matthias, did you want to touch upon one of the other modules that we saw other than the cryptocurrency stealer, for instance?
Yeah, we also saw that the core implant also had modules basically to extract notes or like Apple Notes documents, and it also had different modules for like taking and analyzing photos and also extracting these photos. Most of these were used in order to look for QR codes or for potential passwords for these kind of crypto wallets. But there's basically not a stopping point at this point in time. So we had about 30 test photos like on one of the devices, and we saw that all of these were exfiltrated.
And do you think they're targeting QR codes because of things like authentication apps using those QR codes to set up the two-factor authentication into many of these sort of crypto wallets?
Yes, pretty much. Also, I mean, these are about 15 different implants, many different exploit chains. So the analysis is still continuing. We can't say everything for a fact, but it's very, very likely that if they're already like stealing or like trying to attempt to steal cryptocurrency, that they would also have to bypass two-factor authentication codes, which would also explain why they're targeting like WhatsApp or like IM Agent as well.
And Matthias, you can confirm that we've loaded up. We've certainly seen photos leaving the device over a wire, right? Like you've actually rigged it up and you've seen the photos leave the device. And then can you also speak to whether you've done any testing of crypto as well?
I can definitely speak to the photos. We've seen photos being basically copied over to different parts of the device, and then we've also seen some part like leaving the device. We've attempted to see if some crypto is going to get stolen, so we've hooked up the wallet, but so far we haven't seen this yet. So this is also still ongoing research, and I don't want to speak too much about this to not thwart any potential capabilities.
Yep, that makes sense.
Maybe I'll just take the next question that is also coming in, which is about if it allows direct remote control of a device or just info stealing. So the entire framework is totally modular, and the config file that is on the server basically decides which kind of modules are going to get loaded based on the apps which are currently installed on the phone. So if the config file just has modules for crypto stealers and for like photo stealing, in this case, only these specific modules would be like installed and running. But the framework has capabilities to update the config file to also update all the implants. So in case if the selector would want to remotely control the device, plan files there, like steal passwords or anything else, they would just have to build a module for this. And this is what the exploit framework or like the exploit kit makes actually very, very easy to do. It has some resemblance to older versions of jailbreak, which allowed like hooking into the system, just a lot more advanced.
Great. Well, let's give it another maybe 30 seconds here. And if we don't have any more questions, we can wrap up. But let's give it this is your last call for questions to Spencer and Matthias before we call it a day. Okay. Well, thank you as well. Thank you everyone for your time this afternoon. I know it was last minute. Appreciate you joining. I hope this was helpful. This was recorded. We will send around the recording to anyone who joined. And certainly if anyone wants a private briefing, maybe you had members of your team or staff who couldn't make it today, and you want to go a level deeper on this with them, please reach out to really anyone on this call from iVerify. We will make sure that happens. Thanks again for your time today. That's going to be it from us for now, but we will surely speak to you again soon in the future. Thank you.